This Fuji Cherry's got some issues. We've got some branches die back. That's a great shame because these branches would have been useful. What we do have is this shoot here, so all is not lost. It was in this pot for goodness knows how long when I bought the tree, and I've had it a good 4 years. The compost that's in the soil, completely broken down. It weighs an absolute ton. I think it's just absolutely sopping wet. The roots have died, the branches have died because of the roots dying. So that's part of its story now. Get you out of the pot. Whew, it's the dead branch. Okay, I haven't got a lot to get hold of. Ah, there we go. Wow, I said there's a lot of root in there. I don't think there is. I think there's hardly any roots. Root rake. This would be fast, but it's also going to do damage. I can't afford damage. I already know that we've got issues. Chopstick. Gentle on the roots. Thicker, so it's less cutting. It's got a nice gradual point, so it parts the roots out the way rather than shredding them. And I'm going to push the soil off the roots. Look at that. That is not a good sign. Where I removed a couple of air layers, it reduced the amount of foliage. When you reduce the amount of foliage on a tree, you also reduce the amount of water that the roots will take up. And if the roots are taking up less water, the soil is staying wetter for longer. Roots don't like to be wet for too long. Water takes up space that oxygen could take up, and roots like an aerobic environment. They like that oxygen. They need the oxygen. So the ideal scenario is wet, dry, wet, dry, wet, dry. Plant dry, of course, not like bone dry. How dry you let them get depends on the species preference. But the point is, we don't keep it constantly wet. If the roots aren't taking up as much water as usual, because there's less foliage to pull the water, the soil's going to stay wetter for longer. If you've then got an exceptionally wet climate, or perhaps overzealous watering, and decomposed soil that holds more water anyway, well, it's a recipe for what we've got here. The soil is like a doughy, it's completely decomposed and it's now more like a paste. Terrible for roots. Nursery soils like this tend to get a very bad rap in the bonsai game, and for bonsai trees it's really bad because of the shallowness of the pot. In a growing pot like this, it's actually not the end of the world as long as the soil is dealt with and looked after carefully, i.e. it's repotted at a frequency that keeps the roots in good condition. The soil's just coming away in whole chunks. Like normally you have to like flake it out from between the roots, but the roots have completely decomposed. What fine roots there were are just mush now, just like the soil, and it's just sloughing off. Sloughing? I don't know. It's just coming away in chunks rather than friable pieces. These branches are dead, there's no saving them. Well, there is life in that branch, to be honest with you. We might still get buds from that. The twigs on it are dead. Are they all dead? Maybe I've just... That was alive. I think it'll be okay though. It'll be fine. This is fine. It'll be fine. Coming off in sods. Sods of soil. This is a really good example of when it's best to deal with the roots and the soil situation before you think about reducing the foliage, because when you reduce the foliage you've got less water being drawn from the roots, much more likelihood of overwatering problems as a result. If you can't deal with the roots and you want to make some progress on your tree, that's fine, but just bear in mind that the amount of water that the tree will consume after you have reduced the amount of foliage it has will be less than if it had a full canopy as before. So you change your watering habits accordingly. And letting the soil and the root system get to this state is shame on me, you know. Like, it would be easy for me to say, oh, you know, nursery soil, compost, peat, whatever it is, just breaks down, it's no good for the roots. But this is handler error. Like, I knew that this soil was in the pot. Unfortunately, last year when I should have repotted after doing those air layers, I just couldn't get to it. By the time I had time to get to it, due to commitments away from bonsai, you know, but you can't beat yourself up. Life just gets in the way sometimes. Really what I should have done was repotted it like years ago, before even doing the air layers, get it set up in some good soil, because these Fuji Cherry, I find when they're in an organic soil, they can stay in that soil for years. Like the one that I made from scratch and sold, that was in the same pot in the same inorganic soil for 4 years. Roots are absolutely fine. They're relatively slow growing. If the soil's good, they're happy, they don't mind. I find that's my experience anyway. So with this tree having such a compromised root system and having some pretty shocking soil left in amongst the roots there, the temptation would be, or at least a lot of the questions that are going to come through are, why don't you wash the roots? So I know a lot of professionals would wash these roots, especially with the soil being like this. I'm not going to. If there's any healthy roots in amongst that lot, I don't want to disturb them. I'm not going to fully bare root it. I'm going to try and, and I hope that there are perhaps some living roots in amongst that. Yeah, okay, the environment isn't great there, but if there are any roots there, I don't want to disturb them. I don't want to disturb them with water, with a rake. I don't want to disturb them with a chopstick. I just want to give them the best chance of regrowing and establishing in some good soil. The goal for me is minimum root disturbance while setting the tree up for success. If the tree was super healthy and I wanted to do some drastic work to the nabari, then I would perhaps wash the soil out. But being in a state of extreme compromised health, my preference is to leave what I can alone, do what I can, but leave some soil untouched. Let the tree decide how it's going to deal with this. I don't know, maybe there's a really critical fine root just in there, and if I chopstick or even if I water, I end up disturbing that root, setting it back, and then I get issues. That's my rationale anyway. By leaving something intact, any roots that are alive in there will grow out from that central soil, and then in 2 to 3 years time I'll come in, we'll have loads of healthy roots in the good soil around the outside, and I'll come underneath and then I'll clean out the soil and do some nabari work, leaving more of the perimeter untouched so that growth and development can continue forward. Like, I don't even think I'm going to prune any of the dead roots actually, like, because of the colour of the soil. The only real way that I can genuinely tell if a root's completely dead is by like bending it to see how brittle it is. In doing that, I risk breaking healthy roots, similar to when I pruned this branch. Thought it was dead, pruned it, what do you know, it's not dead. So thinking about the pot choice and the soil composition then, I've got to ask myself what do I want to achieve with this tree. So I'm still in trunk development, and I also care about the health of the tree. So I'm going to go for a pot that's got air pruning capabilities, is deeper to provide room to grow, and it's an appropriate size for the amount of roots we've got. It's not going to swamp the roots and keep it in cold, wet soil, i.e. overpotting it. It's an appropriate amount of space, just enough to fit the root ball. That's going to help the soil warm up and dry out faster so that roots can establish, helping to build a virtuous cycle of wet dry in the soil that the roots enjoy, rather than wet, little bit dry, wet, little bit dry. I'll start with a small layer of soil so that the roots nearest the bottom aren't in contact with the pot. They've actually got some soil to sit on. I'll then carefully work the roots into this container, which is, don't get me wrong, it's snug, it's tight. That's by design though. I want the nabari just above halfway in terms of depth. Somewhere in the middle provides the best balance of moisture and air. Moisture and oxygen, I should say. Just going to turn it just a little bit. There's just an awkward root. There we go. The composition of soil that I'm going for is more of a growing mix. I could put it into an inorganic. That's going to take a lot more watering, and these guys like their water. They need and like to become almost dry between waterings, but they still love their moisture, this species. So I don't want to make life difficult for myself by having to water every 2 minutes when it's hot and the tree is fully established. Because this is a water-loving species, I've gone for about, I don't know, 50% coir with 50% perlite. I give that a good mix, and then to that I add, I don't know, 20% worm castings, which is going to provide microbes and nutrition. have to be careful not to compact this soil. So my chopstick involves doing just enough work to get the soil down and in between the roots without ramming it in there so that it becomes a solid block from the get-go. I can tell when there's a big empty space because the chopstick pretty much just falls through rather than pushing through, like it drops straight down there. So I'm going to mound the soil up really high, and with the chopstick and my finger just wiggle it through into those spaces. And when I start to feel resistance, I know that I've got some soil into that space and I can move on to the next space. That's very, very loose there, so let's keep the soil being pushed down into that pocket. Manipulating the soil with my other hand, making sure there's always a supply of soil. There we go, we firmed up nicely there. There we go, and there's another space here now. Make a nice pile so that I've got plenty of soil to push through. There we go, that's starting to firm up. Lovely. Ah, there we go, there's a very big space down in there. Bring some of the soil around. Keep manipulating it into the right position and the chopstick pushes it into place. The bigger the pile, the more gravity helps. There we go, we're starting to feel good now. That feels much better. Got steady resistance all around there. Give the pot a good tap. Let's get the soil settled. And tapping it's going to re-aerate it so it's a little bit less compacted. We've got a lot coming out of the holes, but that's nothing to worry about. As soon as the roots establish, it will stop falling out. I can always top it up as I need to. This tree is now good to go. I'll get it back out in the garden. If we get any frosts or freezing weather, I'll protect it by bringing it in while it's cold. There you go, buddy. Best of luck.